Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The dream always began with the cold. It seeped into her bones, a damp forest chill that tasted of iron and decay. Above, a sick crimson moon bled across a starless sky, casting the world in shades of rust and shadow. He was there, always there, kneeling in the mud and ruin. His armor was shattered, his breathing a ragged, wet sound that tore through the silence. And his eyes. They were the color of winter frost, of storm clouds gathering over a frozen lake. They were fixed on her, though she was nothing but a ghost in this terrible vision, an unseen witness to his end. His blood, dark in the unnatural light, stained the earth around him. He lifted a hand reaching for her, his fingers trembling. His lips parted, forming a single word, a name that was hers and yet felt like a stranger's on his tongue. Marin. The whisper was a dying breath, a final plea that coiled around her heart and squeezed until she couldn't breathe. Then the light in those silver eyes would flicker and die, and the darkness would swallow him whole. She woke with a gasp, the phantom scent of blood and pine clinging to her senses. The rough wool of her blanket was tangled around her legs, and a sheen of cold sweat covered her skin. Outside her small window, the familiar sounds of her village, Oakfall, were beginning to stir. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture. It was real. It was safe. But the echo of his voice, the image of his death, remained burned behind her eyelids. For 20 years, since she was a girl with scraped knees and wild hair, the man with silver eyes had died for her every single night. And every single morning, she woke up grieving a man she had never met. This was her curse, her secret shame, a madness that she was forced to hide behind the scent of crushed herbs and the quiet diligence of a healer's apprentice. A sharp, frantic ringing of the village bell shattered the morning calm. It was not the gentle call to market, nor the slow toll for prayer. It was the warning bell, the one reserved for fire or attack. Marin's heart leaped into her throat. She threw off her blanket and scrambled to the window, peering down at the cobbled square below. The villagers were pouring from their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. But there was no smoke, no sign of raiders. Instead, at the edge of the village, a column of riders was approaching, their dark banners stark against the morning sky. They moved with a chilling, disciplined silence, their horses' hooves a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. At their head rode a figure cloaked in black, broad-shouldered and imposing even from a distance. The sigil on the banner was a snarling wolf's head, silver on a field of black. The royal crest, King Darren's men. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of fear and awe. The Alpha King, the butcher of the Blackwood, the ruler of the northern realms, a man spoken of only in hushed, fearful whispers. They said he was more beast than man, that his army was a legion of cursed soldiers who felt no pain and knew no cure. They said he hadn't been seen this far south in a decade. Marin dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she pulled on her simple linen tunic and tied back her honey-blonde hair. She had to find Alara, her mentor. The old healer would be needed. Rushing down the narrow wooden stairs, she burst into the apothecary. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scents of dried lavender, chamomile, and willow bark. Alara was already there, her weathered face grim as she packed a leather satchel with bandages and salves. "Stay here, Marin," Alara said, her voice tight. She didn't look up. "Bolt the door behind me. Royal soldiers have needs. Best you're not seen." The unspoken warning hung in the air. Marin was 20, her features gentle but her form womanly. Soldiers, royal or not, were still men. But it wasn't their leering gazes she feared. It was something else. a deep primal dread that had been churning in her gut since the bell first rang. "I can help," she insisted, her voice barely a whisper. "Your help is here," Alara commanded, finally meeting Marin's eyes. Her gaze softened slightly, but the worry remained. "The king is not a kind man, child. He brings war with him like a storm cloud. We will offer our services and pray he moves on quickly." Alara left, the small bell above the door chiming softly in her wake. Marin stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She should listen. She should bolt the door and hide among the herbs and tinctures, safe in her anonymity, but she couldn't. An invisible cord was pulling her, tugging her toward the square, toward the source of that thunderous presence. It was the same pull she felt in her dreams, the desperate, helpless need to reach the dying man. Her feet moved of their own accord. She slipped out the back door, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the damp earth. She crept along the alleyways, keeping to the shadows, her body thrumming with a terrible, inexplicable anticipation. The air had grown heavy, charged with a potent, masculine energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It smelled of steel, leather, and cold, clean earth, a scent that was both foreign and devastatingly familiar. She found a vantage point behind the baker's stall. Peering through a gap between two rain barrels, the square was packed. The king's soldiers, at least 24 of them, had dismounted. They were massive, scarred men, their eyes holding a haunted, predatory stillness. They formed a perimeter, their presence turning the cheerful village square into an occupied territory. The villagers were silent, their gazes fixed on the man who stood in the center, the Alpha King. And Marin's world stopped turning. It was him. The breath left her body in a painful rush, as if she'd been punched. The sounds of the square faded into a dull roar. The faces of her neighbors blurred into a meaningless watercolor. All she could see was him. He was taller than she'd imagined, built with the savage grace of a wolf. His hair was the color of midnight, falling in shaggy locks around a face that was all harsh angles and brutal beauty. A thin, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a detail she knew as well as her own reflection. He wore no crown, only black leather armor that seemed to absorb the light around him, but it was his eyes that held her captive, that rooted her to the spot. They were silver, a startling, piercing silver that seemed to hold all the sorrow and fury of a winter storm. They swept over the crowd with a cold, detached authority, missing nothing. He was the man from her dream, alive, breathing, real. He was not dying in the mud. He was standing before her, radiating a power so immense it felt like a physical force. The dream wasn't a dream. The vision wasn't a fantasy. It was him. A choked sound escaped her lips, a small, wounded gasp. A few people nearby turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her knuckles white, trying to stifle the sob of shock and terror that was clawing its way up her throat. He was real. The man she had mourned every dawn for 2 decades was real. The village elder, a portly, officious man named Boren, stepped forward, bowing low. "Your Majesty, Oakfall is honored by your presence. How may we serve the throne?" King Darren did not look at him. His gaze was still moving, scanning, searching. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep beneath the earth. It was the same voice that whispered her name in the dark. "I have no need for honors, Elder. I have need of healers." A current of fear passed through the crowd. Healers for the king's army meant one thing. The war was going badly. The stories of the blight spreading from the Shadowlands, of twisted creatures and a curse that rotted men from the inside out, were not just stories after all. "Our village has a healer, Your Majesty," Boren said, gesturing toward where Alara stood, her satchel held tightly in her hands. "Alara is skilled in all the old ways." Darren's gaze fell upon Alara. He gave a curt nod, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "The wounds my men suffer are not of the old ways. It is a curse, a decay of the flesh and spirit that poultices cannot mend and magic cannot touch. I seek those with a stronger gift. Anyone who can ease the suffering of a cursed soul, I will pay any price." His words were a plea disguised as a command. For the first time, Marin saw past the fearsome legend. She saw the weight on his shoulders, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a king carrying a dying kingdom. He was the man from her dream, And though he was standing, he was still dying. She could feel it. A slow internal decay that mirrored the curse afflicting his men. The sight of it, the intuitive knowledge of it, was an agony that resonated deep within her soul. Her composure shattered. Her vision began to swim, the edges darkening. The connection between the dream and this reality was too much, a violent collision of two worlds that should never have met. She stumbled back, knocking over one of the empty rain barrels. It hit the cobblestones with a loud, hollow clatter that echoed through the unnatural silence of the square. Every head turned, and then his eyes found hers. The world went silent. The storm in his silver gaze stilled, replaced by a look of such profound, earth-shattering shock that it stole the air from her lungs. It was not the look of a king seeing a clumsy village girl. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. Recognition flickered there, raw and undeniable, followed by a wave of something so ancient and painful it made her want to weep. He took a step toward her, then another. The crowd parted before him as if by an unseen force. He moved with a predator's purpose. His eyes locked on hers, pinning her in place. The scent of him grew stronger, pine and ash and a deep wild musk that spoke of winter nights and moonlit hunts. It was the scent of her dreams, the scent of his death. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't know her. She was a no one, a healer's apprentice in a forgotten village. He was a king, but the way he looked at her, he saw her, he truly saw her. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the faint lines of sorrow around his mouth. The entire village was watching, holding its collective breath. She felt stripped bare, exposed, her deepest secret standing before her in flesh and blood. His lips parted, and the world held its breath. His voice was not the command of a king, but a raw, broken whisper, a sound of disbelief and agonizing hope that shattered the very air between them. "It's you!" The two words hung in the air, a devastating pronouncement that severed Maren from her own life. "It's you." The world, which had gone silent, crashed back in a roar of sound. The shifting feet of the soldiers, the sharp intake of breath from the villagers, the frantic beating of her own heart. He knew her. The man whose death she had witnessed 1,000 times knew her face, and his voice held the weight of a history she couldn't remember. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She took a step back, her body screaming to flee, to run until her lungs burned, and the memory of his silver eyes was nothing but a blur. But his gaze held her fast, a physical tether she could not break. A man at the king's side, his face a road map of old scars, and his presence second only to Darren's in its intensity, moved forward. "Your Majesty, Hu Yunhao," he said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "We are exposed here." The king didn't seem to hear him. His focus was entirely on Maren, his expression a storm of warring emotions, disbelief, fury, and beneath it all, a sliver of something so fragile it looked like hope. "Your name," he commanded, the sound tearing from him, raw and unguarded. She couldn't speak, her throat had closed up, thick with unshed tears and a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight in her chest. She could only shake her head, a small, desperate movement. Beside her, Alara stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Maren's shoulder. "She is Maren Elthor, Your Majesty, my apprentice. She is simple." Easily startled, she meant no disrespect. The lie was a flimsy shield, but it was all the old healer had. Maren. Hearing her name from Alara's lips while staring into the face of the man who whispered it in her dreams was a dizzying, sickening twist. King Darren's eyes flickered to Alara, and the brief vulnerability in his face was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, unyielding authority. "Your apprentice will be coming with me." It was not a request. It was a royal decree, absolute and final. The villagers gasped. Boren the elder paled. Alara's hand tightened on Maren's shoulder. "Your Majesty, she is only a girl. She has no skills that would serve a royal army. Her knowledge is of poultices and feverfew, nothing more." "I will be the judge of her skills," Darren said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He took another step, and now the potent scent of him, that wild familiar mix of pine, ash, and cold iron, was all around her, stealing her breath. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture to two of his guards. "Take her. Gently. She will ride with me." The guards moved, their armored forms bracketing her. Maren felt a sob finally break free, a small, pathetic sound. "No," she whispered, the word lost in the cold morning air. She looked at Alara, her eyes pleading. Alara's face was a mask of helpless fury. She was a village healer. He was the Alpha King. There was no fight to be had. One of the guards placed a firm, but not unkind hand on her arm. The touch was an electric shock that jolted her into motion. She was being taken, torn from the only home she had ever known, by the ghost who had haunted her life. As they led her toward the king's massive black warhorse, she could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her back, eyes filled with pity, suspicion, and fear. In the space of 5 minutes, she had gone from a quiet apprentice to a thing claimed by the fearsome Alpha King. Her life in Oakfall was over. The journey to the war camp was a blur of muted terror. She was placed in front of Darren on his horse, her back pressed against the hard planes of his chest. His proximity was an exquisite torture. Every shift of his body, every breath he took, sent shudders through her. She tried to hold herself rigid, to create a space between them, but it was impossible. His arm was a steel band around her waist, holding her securely in the saddle. She could feel the warmth of him through her thin tunic, smell the scent of leather and winter on his skin. It was the scent of her nightmares made real, and it made her feel faint. He did not speak a word to her, his silence as heavy and oppressive as a shroud. The camp, when they reached it, was a city of gray tents and despair. It sprawled across a desolate clearing, carved from the encroaching forest like a festering wound. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something cloying and foul, the scent of sickness, of rot. Men moved with a heavy, listless purpose, their faces gaunt, their eyes holding a haunted, vacant look. These were the cursed soldiers. She was led not to a medical tent, but to the king's own command tent at the center of the camp. It was larger than the others, made of dark canvas and staked down with iron. The guards posted outside didn't meet her eyes as Darren pushed aside the heavy flap and propelled her inside. The interior was stark and functional. A large wooden table dominated the space, covered in maps held down by daggers. A cot was pushed against one wall, its furs in disarray. A single lantern cast flickering, dancing shadows. He let the flap fall shut behind them, plunging them into an intimate, claustrophobic twilight. The sounds of the camp were muffled, distant. They were alone. Maren's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might break. She backed away from him until her shoulders hit the rough canvas of the tent wall. He stood by the table, watching her, his silver eyes glowing in the dim light. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. He was studying her, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were peeling back her skin, trying to see the secrets of her soul. "In my dreams," he began, his voice a low, gravelly thing that vibrated through the small space. "You are always weeping." The word struck her like a physical blow, her breath hitched. He dreams of me, too. The thought was both terrifying and validating. She was not mad, or if she was not alone in her madness. "Who are you?" he demanded, taking a step closer. The floor was just packed earth, but his footsteps seemed to shake the ground. "What are you to me? I have seen your face every night for a decade, a vision of sorrow I could not name. And now you stand before me, flesh and blood." She wanted to answer, but her voice was trapped. How could she explain the unexplainable? "I've watched you die every night since I was a child. I know the exact shade of your blood on the forest floor. I know the sound of your last breath." He would think her a witch, a demon, the source of the curse itself. Her silence seemed to infuriate him. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his powerful frame looming over her. He was so close now she had to crane her neck to see his face. The scar above his eye was a pale, jagged line against his tanned skin. She could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the immense, crushing weight of his crown. "Speak," he roared, and the force of his command was a physical wave that made her flinch. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. She shook her head, pressing herself harder against the canvas wall, as if she could somehow melt through it and disappear. His anger seemed to drain away as quickly as it had come, replaced by a raw, desperate frustration. He reached out, his hand clamping around her upper arm. Do not play games with me, girl. My kingdom is dying. My men are rotting from the inside out. I have followed omens and whispers to this forgotten village, seeking a miracle. And instead I find the ghost from my nightmares. Tell me what it means." His touch was fire. Where his fingers wrapped around her arm, her skin burned, but it was more than just heat. A jolt, sharp and profound, shot through her, a current of pure energy that made the air crackle. For a split second her vision blurred, and she saw it. Not her dream, but his. She saw herself, standing on a windswept cliff, her hair wild, her face streaked with tears, as she looked down at a burning ship on a dark sea. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her dizzy and gasping. Darren recoiled as if he'd been burned, snatching his hand back. He stared at his palm, then back at her, his silver eyes wide with shock. He had felt it too, that impossible spark of connection, of shared memory. What was that?" he breathed, his kingly composure completely shattered. Before Marin could even begin to process it, the tent flap was thrown open. The scarred commander Ronan stood there, his face grim. He did not look at Marin, his gaze fixed solely on his king. "Darren," he said, the use of the king's given name a measure of the urgency. "It's Jovan. The fever is on him. He's not going to last the night." A shadow passed over Darren's face, a deep and personal grief. He straightened up, the king once more, the moment of shared shock locked away behind his iron will. He looked from Ronan back to Marin, a new chilling resolve hardening his features. He had no answers, but he had a test. "Come," he said, his voice flat and cold. He turned and strode out of the tent. Marin stood frozen for a moment, the ghost of his touch still burning on her arm. The echo of that strange vision swimming in her head. Ronan gave her a sharp, impatient look. Left with no choice, she followed, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven ground as she hurried to keep up with the king's long strides. He led her to the largest tent in the camp, a long, grim structure from which a low sound of moaning emanated. The smell of sickness and death was overpowering here. He pushed aside the flap and led her into a scene from a nightmare. Dozens of men lay on cots, their bodies racked with fever, their skin pale and clammy. Many had wounds that refused to heal, angry, blackened flesh that seemed to crawl with a life of its own. Healers moved between them, their faces etched with exhaustion and futility. Darren led her to a cot at the far end of the tent. A young man, barely older than she was, lay thrashing against his restraints. His skin was sheened with a feverish sweat, and a dark vein-like pattern spread from a wound on his chest, crawling up his neck. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at some horror only he could see. "This is Jovan," Darren said, his voice tight with controlled sorrow. "He was one of my best. He saved my life at the Battle of Grey River. Now the curse is consuming him." He turned to face her, his silver eyes boring into hers. There was no more confusion, only a desperate, brutal challenge. "You are a part of this fate, this curse that haunts my sleep. I do not know how, but I will have my answer. You said you are a healer." He gestured to the dying soldier, his hand a blade cutting through the foul air. "Heal him." The command was an executioner's sentence. "Heal him." The words echoed in the cavernous tent, stripping away the last of Marin's defenses. All around her was the chorus of the dying, rasping breaths, fevered mutters, the soft weeping of men who knew their end was near. And at the center of it all was Jovan, his body a battlefield where some unnatural darkness was winning a decisive victory. Marin's mind went blank with sheer animal terror. She was an apprentice. She knew how to grind willow bark for pain, how to steep chamomile to soothe a fretful stomach, how to set a simple fracture. She was a mender of the mundane. This was a war against a shadow, a plague born of black magic. The other healers, men and women with decades of experience, watched her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had already failed. What could this slip of a girl, dragged from a backwater village, possibly do? Her gaze flickered to Darren. He stood like a statue carved from mountain stone, his silver eyes merciless. There was no compassion in them, only a raw, desperate need for an answer. He had not brought her here to be a healer. He had brought her here to be an omen, a key to unlock the puzzle of his own cursed fate. She was a tool to be tested, and if she failed, she would be discarded. The fear was a physical thing, a block of ice in her stomach. But as she looked at Jovan, at the dark, pulsing veins that marred his young skin, something else stirred within her. It was the instinct Alara had so carefully nurtured in her, the core of her true gift, which had nothing to do with herbs and everything to do with listening. "Don't just look at the wound, child," Ilara's voice whispered in her memory. "Listen to the pain. Every illness, every injury has a voice. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Quiet. That was all she had. Taking a shaky breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, Marin moved to the side of the cot. She ignored the skeptical stares, ignored the suffocating presence of the king at her back. She closed her eyes, shutting out the grim reality of the tent and focusing on the dying soldier. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently coming to rest on Jovan's fever-hot brow. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt went through her 1,000 times stronger than the one she'd shared with the king. It was not a spark of energy, it was a plunge into an abyss. She was dragged from her own consciousness and into the chaos of Jovan's. She felt his terror, saw the fragmented memories of the battle, the shriek of a creature made of shadow and claw, the searing pain as its touch landed on his chest, the immediate soul-deep cold that had followed. And she felt the curse. It was not a poison or a disease. It was alive. A hungry, parasitic entity of pure darkness, anchored to his life force, feeding on his fear and his pain. It felt vicious, spiteful. It sensed her presence, her light touch a foreign intrusion into its domain. It lashed out, a wave of icy despair washing over her, whispering of failure, of death, of the futility of hope. It showed her an image of the king, lying dead in the mud beneath a crimson moon, his silver eyes vacant. Her dream, the curse, knew her deepest fear and was using it as a weapon. A sob caught in her throat. She nearly pulled her hand back, ready to surrender, to admit defeat. But then she felt Jovan's spirit, a tiny, flickering ember buried deep beneath the crushing weight of the shadow. It was faint, nearly extinguished, but it was still there, still fighting. And it called to her. She couldn't fight the darkness with force. It was ancient and powerful, and it would devour her. But Alara's words came back to her. Listen, she didn't try to push the curse back. She didn't try to burn it out. She simply held on. She let her own energy flow from her hand, not as a weapon, but as a balm. She didn't send fire, she sent warmth. She didn't send a command. She sent a quiet, persistent hum of life, of peace, of a sunlit meadow and the scent of rain on dry earth. She poured all the quiet strength she possessed into that single point of contact. She thought of her small herb garden behind the apothecary, of the stubborn, gentle way life pushed through the soil after a long winter. She anchored herself to that feeling, that simple, undeniable truth of existence, and offered it to the dying man. At first, nothing happened. The darkness seethed, resisting her. But her energy was not aggressive. It did not provoke. It was simply there, a constant, gentle presence in the midst of the violent storm. Slowly, tentatively, the raging torrent of the curse began to quiet. The frantic, hungry pulsing beneath her hand began to slow. From the foot of the bed, Darren watched, his breath caught in his chest. He saw the girl tremble, saw the sweat bead on her pale forehead. He saw the sheer, agonizing effort it was costing her. And then he saw the light. It began as a faint, barely perceptible shimmer around her hand, a soft, golden luminescence that stood in stark defiance of the tense, grim twilight. It was the color of honey, of the last rays of a summer sunset. The light spread, flowing from her palm, into Jovan's skin, not burning the black veins, but flowing alongside them, around them, bathing them in its gentle glow, and the black veins began to retreat. Like shadows fleeing the dawn, they receded from her touch. The angry, web-like pattern that had crawled up Jovan's neck and across his face began to shrink, pulling back toward the original wound on his chest. A collective gasp went through the healers who had gathered to watch. They were witnessing an impossibility, magic they had never seen, a power that did not confront the curse, but soothed it. Jovan's thrashing stilled. The wild, terrified look in his eyes softened, his focus returning from some distant hell. His breathing, which had been a ragged, painful gasp, deepened and evened out into the slow rhythm of sleep. The raging fever under Marin's hand cooled to a natural warmth. The effort was draining her. Marin felt her own life force being siphoned away, poured into the void the curse was leaving behind. The world began to tilt, the edges of her vision turning gray and fuzzy. Her arm felt impossibly heavy. She had contained the shadow, pushed it back into its lair, but she hadn't destroyed it. She had only bought him time. It was the most she could do. It was everything she had. With a final shuddering breath, she drew the last of the curse back into the blackened flesh around the wound, sealing it there. The golden light from her hand faded, leaving her trembling in the sudden gloom. The connection broke. The strength that had been holding her up vanished, and her legs gave way. She fell, a dead weight, into the darkness that was rushing up to meet her, but she didn't hit the ground. Before she could fall, Darren was there. He moved with the unnatural speed of his kind, crossing the space in a single silent stride. He caught her, one arm scooping behind her knees, the other supporting her back. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, her head lolling against his shoulder, her limp hand falling against the bare skin of his neck. The moment her skin touched his, the world exploded. It was not the brief jolt from before. It was a cataclysm. A vision, clearer and more powerful than any dream, seized them both. They were no longer in the medical tent. They stood on a windswept cliff under a sky filled with two moons, one silver, one pale blue. The wind whipped a dark cloak around his shoulders and tore at the simple white dress she wore. They were younger, their faces unmarred by the sorrows that now defined them. He was holding her hands, his silver eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate love she recognized on a level deeper than memory. "They will hunt us," his voice echoed in the vision, full of a pain that was ancient and fresh. "The pact is broken, they will not stop." Then her own voice answered, a voice she had never heard aloud, yet knew as her own. It was clear and strong, filled with a certainty that defied the worlds. "Let them, you are my pack. I am your anchor. Time is a river, my love. We will always find our way back to the shore." He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers. The scent of pine and a forgotten world filled her senses. "Promise me, Marin. Promise you will find me." "Always, Darren," she whispered, and the name felt like home on her tongue. "I will always find you." The vision shattered. Darren stood frozen in the middle of the medical tent, the unconscious girl cradled in his arms. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not with the adrenaline of battle, but with the shock of a soul-deep recognition. The healers and soldiers stared, not at the sleeping form of Jovan, but at the face of their king. His mask of iron control had been utterly destroyed. In its place was a look of raw, terrified awe. He looked down at the pale face of the woman in his arms. She was not a ghost from a nightmare. She was not an omen or a tool. She was a promise, a memory he had lost. And the curse that plagued his kingdom suddenly felt like a trivial thing compared to the terrifying, impossible truth of the woman he was holding. He hadn't just found a healer, he had found the missing half of his own forgotten soul. The world returned to Darren in shattered fragments. The low groan of a wounded man from a nearby cot, the acrid smell of burnt herbs and sickness, the weight of the woman in his arms, a weight that was both impossibly light and heavy enough to anchor his soul to the earth. His men were staring, their faces a mixture of awe and stark terror. They had not seen the vision, but they had seen its aftermath on their king's face. They had seen the Alpha of the North, the unbreakable, unfeeling butcher of Blackwood, look as though he had seen the face of God, or the devil. Ronan was the first to move, his scarred face a mask of grim concern. He stepped forward, his voice a low growl meant only for Darren. "My king, what was that? Witchcraft?" Darren's gaze, which had been lost in the pale, unconscious face of Marin, snapped to his commander. The raw vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold fire. "It was a memory," he said, the words feeling foreign and unbelievable on his own tongue. He looked back down at her. Her hand had slipped from his neck to rest against his chest, right over his heart. Even in her deep faint, she felt like a missing part of him that had finally been returned. Anchor, the word from the vision echoed in his mind, a truth he felt in his very bones. "Take over here, Ronan," Darren commanded. his voice regaining its familiar authority. "Double the watch on Jovan. If his condition changes in the slightest, I am to be told." He adjusted his hold on Marin, turning to leave the tent. "No one is to disturb me. No one." He strode from the tent of the dying, carrying her as if she were a precious, fragile treasure. The soldiers and healers in his path parted like a receding tide, their eyes wide, their mouths agape. He ignored them. The politics of his pack, the fear in their eyes, meant nothing in that moment. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the cataclysmic truth she had unlocked within him. Back in the command tent, he laid her gently on his own cot. Pulling the heavy wolf pelt furs over her slight frame, she looked impossibly small and out of place against the backdrop of his harsh military life, a wildflower blooming on a battlefield. He stood over her for a long moment, tracing the line of her jaw with his eyes, the curve of her lips, the sweep of her honey-blonde hair against the dark fur. Marin. He had whispered her name in his dreams of sorrow, but the Marin in the vision had been a creature of fire and strength, a queen in her own right. His queen. The thought was a physical blow. He turned away, pacing the confines of the tent like a caged wolf. A king could not afford such fantasies. He was bound by duty, by a curse that was eating his people alive. This woman. She was either his salvation or the most intricate and cruel trap the gods had ever devised. The vision felt real, soul deep, but his life had taught him to trust nothing that could not be held or killed. He stoked the small brazier in the corner, the light casting his long shadow across the canvas walls. He waited. Marin woke slowly, dragged from a deep and dreamless sleep. Her first sensation was one of warmth, a profound, enveloping heat that seemed to soak into her bones, chasing away the bone-deep chill that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. The second was the scent. Pine and ash and the wild, musky scent of a predator. Darren's scent. It was infused in the heavy furs that covered her, in the very air she breathed. Her eyes fluttered open. She was not in the grim medical tent. She was in a space of canvas and shadow, lit by the soft flickering glow of a brazier. She was lying on a cot, tucked into a nest of furs that smelled of him. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. She sat up, the furs pooling around her waist, and her eyes landed on him. He was standing by the map table, his back to her, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. He was utterly still, but his stillness was that of a wolf before it strikes, a coil of barely contained power. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a rough, fragile whisper. He turned slowly. His face was unreadable in the shifting shadows, but his silver eyes seemed to burn with their own internal light. "You are in my tent." "Jovan, the soldier, is he?" "He sleeps," Darren cut in. "The curse in him is quiet for the first time in weeks. You have bought him time." He took a step toward the cot. "What you did in there, I have never seen magic like it." "It wasn't magic," she said, clutching the edge of the fur like a shield. "I don't know what it was, I just listened. And when I caught you," he continued, his voice dropping lower, his eyes never leaving hers, "when you touched me, what did we see?" The question hung between them, heavy and dangerous. The memory of the vision rushed back. The twin moons, the wind, the desperate promises of a love so powerful it defied time itself. The sound of her own voice, strong and clear, promising to find him. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I saw a cliff, and 2 moons in the sky." His jaw tightened. It was the confirmation he had been dreading and hoping for. "So you saw it too. It was not a fever dream of my own making." He moved closer still, stopping at the foot of the cot. He was a mountain of shadow and silver, overwhelming the small space. "In that vision, you called me Darren. You spoke my name as if you had said it 1,000 times. She could only nod, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now threaded with a startling, terrifying sense of belonging. The man from her nightmares was also the man from a forgotten, beautiful memory. He was her grief and her home all at once. "Tell me what it means," he commanded, but the word was not a roar this time. It was a plea, the sound of a man who had been lost in the dark for a long time and had just seen a flicker of light. "For a decade I have dreamed of a weeping woman I could not save. I thought it was a premonition, a warning, but it was you. And the dream I have of your sorrow, It is nothing compared to the agony I felt in that memory. The agony of losing you. I don't know, she whispered, tears blurring her vision. My whole life, I have watched you die. Every night, under a blood moon, you whisper my name. And then you are gone. His expression hardened, a flicker of the cold king returning. The blood moon, the seers have foretold that the next one, a fortnight from now, will be the apex of the curse. The day it becomes irreversible. The day my kingdom is lost for good. He looked at her then, a dawning, terrible understanding in his eyes. It is all connected. You, me, the curse, the blood moon, we have lived this before. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers where it clutched the fur. The air between his skin and hers crackled with a palpable energy. The vision, it spoke of a broken pact, of being hunted, of you being my anchor. His voice was raw. My pack, my people. Since my coronation 10 years ago, we have been adrift. Our senses are duller, our tempers shorter, our bond with the land is weakening. And then came the curse. It is as if the soul of our people has been untethered, as if our anchor was lost. He looked at her, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked into a terrifying, magnificent shape. It was you. When I lost you, my pack lost its anchor. Before Marin could respond, the tent flap was thrust open. Ronan stood there, his expression thunderous. He ignored Marin completely, his focus a burning brand on his king. The men are restless, Ronan stated, his voice tight with disapproval. They saw what happened. They are speaking of witchcraft. They say you have brought a sorceress into our camp. They fear she is the cause of the curse, not its cure. Darren's back stiffened. He did not turn to face his commander. The men will hold their tongues, or I will silence them myself. It is not just the men, Ronan pressed, stepping into the tent. His eyes, hard as flint, finally fell on Marin, and she shrank back under the weight of his open hostility. Your council will hear of this. Bringing an unknown, unvetted girl into your personal tent. After such a display, they will see it as a weakness, an obsession. They will say she has enchanted you. Let them, Darren said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. He turned his head just enough to pin Ronan with a glacial stare. My decisions are my own. Darren, you are our king, Ronan pleaded, his tone softening slightly, betraying the deep loyalty beneath his insubordination. But you are also our alpha. Our strength comes from the pack's trust in you. If that trust is broken. Darren finally turned fully, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The raw power that radiated from him was suffocating, a primal dominance that demanded submission. My pack's trust was broken a decade ago, old friend. We have all felt it, a hollow space where our heart should be. Today, for the first time, I felt that space begin to fill. He glanced back at Marin, and for a fleeting second, the man from the vision looked out from the king's eyes. I will not lose it again. He walked back to the cot, his movement fluid and decisive. He looked down at Marin, his face a mask of grim determination. He was king, he was alpha, and he had made a decision. He reached down, his fingers gently but firmly closing around her wrist. The spark was there, a familiar current that now felt less like a shock and more like a homecoming. You are not a witch, he stated, his voice clear and ringing with absolute authority, for her and for the commander who watched them. You are a memory, a debt the fates owe me. He looked her directly in the eyes, a silent vow passing between them, a claim that transcended time. Whatever we were, whatever we are to become, it begins now. You will stay by my side. You will not leave this tent without my permission. The answers to this curse are locked inside of you, and I will tear the world apart to find them. His grip on her wrist tightened, not painfully, but with an inescapable finality. You belong to me now. The days that followed were a strange, suspended reality. Marin lived within the confines of the king's tent, a gilded prisoner in a cage of canvas and secrets. The declaration, you belong to me now, echoed in every silent moment between them. It was a brand on her soul, a claim that was both terrifying and, in a deep hidden part of her, profoundly right. Darren was a creature of intense, disciplined routine. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet and precise, as he donned his black leather armor. He spent his days in council with his commanders, the low, urgent murmur of their voices a constant presence on the other side of the canvas wall. He ate his meals in near silence, his silver eyes often fixed on her, not with malice, but with a burning, analytical intensity, as if he could decipher the language of their shared past just by watching her breathe. Marin's world shrank to the size of the tent, yet in another way, it expanded infinitely inward. She was surrounded by the scent of him, the physical proof of his existence. It was no longer the phantom smell of a dream, but the tangible aroma of leather, cold steel, and the pine and ash scent of his skin that clung to the furs and the very air. In the long hours she was left alone, she explored this new, dangerous territory. She ran her fingers over the maps on his table, tracing the names of places she'd only ever heard in stories. The jagged peaks, the whispering marshes, the ruins of Silverwood. She touched the hilt of a dagger left on the table, its metal cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the familiar, worn wood of her herb grinder. This was his world. A world of war, strategy, and death. Sleep offered no escape. Her dream of his death beneath the blood moon continued to plague her, but now it was different. It was sharper, more vivid. She could feel the damp cold of the earth, smell the coppery tang of his blood, and sometimes another vision would bleed through, the cliff, the two moons, the desperate promise. The two realities warred in her mind, one a prophecy of his end, the other a memory of their beginning. Her only respite was her work. Daron, seeing the undeniable proof of her ability, had allowed her access to Jovan. Each day, she was escorted by two silent, hulking guards to the medical tent. The atmosphere there had shifted. The healers, who had once looked at her with scorn, now watched with a mixture of fear and reverence. They gave her a wide berth as she knelt by Jovan's cot. The young soldier was improving. The black veins had receded completely, contained within the original wound, which was now scabbed over with an unhealthy-looking black crust. His fever was gone, and he was lucid, though weak. "It feels quiet," he whispered to her one afternoon, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. "The hunger, the cold, it's still there under the surface, but it's sleeping. You made it sleep." Marin would place her hand on his forehead, and though she never saw the golden light again, she could feel the connection. She would pour her quiet, steadying energy into him, reinforcing the fragile wall she had built around the curse. Each session left her drained, her bones aching with a profound weariness. As she walked back to Darren's tent, the whispers of the camp would follow her, the king's witch, the anchor, the omen shadow. She was a living myth, a creature of fear and hope that they did not understand. Darren never asked what she did to Jovan. He simply watched her return, her face pale with exhaustion, and a muscle would work in his jaw. He would gesture to the food left for her, his silent command to eat, to replenish the strength she had spent on his man. One evening, after a particularly draining session, she stumbled as she entered the tent, her vision graying at the edges. Before she could fall, he was there, his hands gripping her upper arms, steadying her. "This is costing you," he said, his voice a low growl. It wasn't a question. "He is getting better," she managed, leaning against his strength for a moment longer than necessary. His grip was firm, possessive, yet the heat of his hands was a comforting anchor in her dizzying exhaustion. "You are a well I am draining to water a single dying plant, while the entire forest burns," he said, his voice harsh with a frustration that wasn't directed at her. "It is not enough. You save one man, but you cannot save them all. You cannot save the pack." He released her abruptly and turned away, running a hand through his dark hair. "That vision we shared. It is the key, but it is a lock I do not know how to turn." He slammed his fist down on the map table, making the daggers rattle. The contained violence in the act made her flinch. "I have scoured the royal libraries, sent riders to the lore keepers. There is no record of a broken pact, no mention of an alpha losing his anchor. It is as if our history has been erased." "Perhaps it wasn't written in a book," Marin whispered, finding a sliver of the strength she'd had in the vision. He turned to her, his silver eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "A memory," she said, her voice gaining a little confidence. "It lives in here." She touched her temple. "And here." She touched her chest over her heart. When we touch, we see it, feel it." The air in the tent grew thick, charged with the unspoken implication. To see more, they would have to touch again. The first time had been an accident, a collision. To do it deliberately was to step off a cliff together, with no knowledge of what lay below. Darren stared at her, a long, drawn-out silence stretching between them. She could see the war in his eyes, the king's caution battling the man's desperate need for answers, the alpha's instinct for self-preservation fighting the primal pull toward his mate. Finally, the battle was lost, or won. He moved toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The scent of him was overwhelming, a heady mix of power and pine that clouded her thoughts. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his hand, his calloused fingers hovering inches from her cheek. The space between them crackled with a potent, terrifying energy. It was a question, a silent request for permission that his royal authority had never before needed to ask. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified. Terrified of the power that surged between them, of the forgotten history that haunted them, of the man who stood before her, offering a key that could unlock her soul or shatter it completely. But she was more terrified of not knowing. Slowly she leaned forward, closing the small distance, pressing her cheek into his palm. The world dissolved into light and sound. They were in a forest, ancient and vast. The trees had silver bark that shimmered in the moonlight, and the air hummed with a primal, untamed magic. They were younger still, barely more than youths, and they were running, laughing, their hands clasped together. He was not a king, and she was not a healer's apprentice. He was simply Darren, and she was Marin, and the world was theirs. The bond between them was a tangible thing, a thread of golden light that connected their souls, visible only to them. They will never agree to it, his younger self said, his voice full of defiant hope. An alpha of the North Pack and a daughter of the Sun Weavers. The old laws forbid it. Her younger self, her hair a cascade of honey gold woven with moon petal flowers, turned to him, her eyes alight with a fierce love. Then we will make a new law, your strength and my light. Together we are the anchor. The pact will be not of blood, but of soul. It will bind our packs and heal the schism that has divided our people for 1,000 years. The vision shifted. They stood before a great heart tree, its leaves like spun silver. An elder from his pack, his face grim, and a priestess from hers, her eyes full of sorrow, stood as witnesses. He held a ceremonial knife, and she held a bowl of glowing water. The Alpha gives his blood to the earth, the elder intoned. The Weaver gives her light to the sky, the priestess whispered. He sliced his palm, and his blood, dark and potent, dripped onto the roots of the tree. She plunged her hands into the bowl, and a soft golden light flowed from her fingertips, rising like mist into the silver branches. A bond of soul, not of blood, they said together, their voices ringing with the power of an unbreakable oath. The wolf and the sun, united, an anchor for our people, forever. The vision fractured again, violently this time. The scene was one of chaos, fire. The silver forest was burning, men in dark armor, bearing the crest of a coiled serpent, were cutting down the Sunweavers. There was screaming, the smell of blood and ash. Darren was fighting, a great silver wolf at his side, tearing through their enemies. But there were too many. He was trying to get to her. She was standing by the heart tree, a shield of golden light holding back 3 of the serpent-marked knights. But the shield was failing. A man with a cruel, scarred face, his eyes burning with a cold fire, lifted a jagged obsidian dagger. A soul pack can be cut, the man snarled, but only with a life. Darren roared her name, a sound of pure agony. He was almost there, but he was too late. The obsidian dagger plunged into her chest. The golden light exploded, shattering like glass. The bond between them, the visible golden thread, snapped. The pain was absolute, an agony that transcended body and soul, a tearing of the universe itself. Marin felt the phantom blade pierce her own chest, and Darren staggered back, a raw cry torn from his throat, clutching his heart as if the wound were his own. And then a final image. Her younger self, lying at the base of the burning heart tree, her eyes fading. Darren was kneeling over her, his face a mask of unbearable grief. Her hand came up to touch his cheek. "Time is a river, my love," she whispered, her voice fading. "Find me, on the other shore." The vision shattered. Marin stumbled back, gasping, her hand flying to her chest where the phantom dagger had struck. Darren was on one knee, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The silence in the tent was a living thing, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 years of love and loss. He looked up, and the face of the king was gone. In its place was the raw, broken face of the man who had lost everything. Tears tracked through the grime on his cheeks, the first tears he had likely shed in a decade. "They didn't just kill you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with a grief so ancient it was a part of his soul. "They cut you away. They used a cursed blade to sever our bond and erase the memory from our people. They made me forget you." He rose to his feet, his movements unsteady. He looked at her, and she was no longer a mystery, no longer a witch or an omen. She was Marin, his Marin, the anchor to his soul, torn away and finally, impossibly, returned. "The blood moon," he breathed, the realization dawning with chilling clarity. "It is not the day the curse wins. It is the anniversary, the day they killed you, the day the pact was broken. The curse on my people. It is the echo of a soul bond being severed. It is my pack's unending grief. And my dream," his voice broke, "my dream of you dying is not a prophecy. It's the memory of the last time I failed to save you." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching for her, no longer hesitant, but with a certainty that was absolute. "But you are here now, alive." His silver eyes blazed with a new, terrifying light, the grief solidifying into a diamond-hard resolve. "And the Serpent Clan, who thought they had destroyed us, are still out there." He looked toward the maps on his table, a predator's snarl twisting his lips. "They are the ones behind this new curse, this blight from the Shadowlands. They are trying to finish what they started." He turned back to her, his gaze holding hers, a promise of love and a declaration of war. "This time," he vowed, his voice a low, deadly rumble that was felt more than heard, "I will not fail. They took you from me once. They will not do it again." Before she could react, his hand cupped the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her skin as he drew her closer. He lowered his head, and his lips claimed hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a brand, a claim, a desperate, drowning homecoming. It was 1,000 years of loss, and a lifetime of hope poured into a single searing moment. It was the taste of pine and ash, of grief and fury, and of a love so powerful it had refused to die. The world outside the tent, the war, the curse, it all fell away. There was only him. There was only them. An alpha who had found his anchor, a soul who had found its shore, and in the distance, a blood moon was waiting to rise. The kiss was a cataclysm. It shattered the last vestiges of the quiet apprentice named Marin Elthor and reforged her in the fire of a memory 1,000 years old. She was not just a healer, she was a sun weaver, a daughter of light, the other half of a sacred broken pact. His lips were not those of a stranger, but of the man she had promised to find across the river of time. The taste of him, the feel of his hand tangled in her hair, the low growl that rumbled in his chest. It was all devastatingly familiar. A song her soul had never forgotten how to sing. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless, foreheads pressed together, the air in the tent electric, with the power they had unleashed. The ghosts of their past were no longer haunting them. They were standing with them, demanding retribution. "The Serpent Clan," Darren said, his voice a raw, ragged thing against her skin. "The sigil from the vision, I've seen it before. On the bodies of the blighted creatures that spill from the Shadowlands. They are led by a sorcerer named Malachor. He has been a thorn in my side for years, a shadow I could never grasp. Now I know why. He is not just an enemy, he is an inheritance." Marin's mind was racing, the memories of the Sunweavers flooding her. They were not warriors, but protectors. Their magic was one of life, of light, of healing the earth and anchoring the wild, primal spirit of the wolf packs. The Serpent Clan practiced a corrupted, parasitic magic, one that fed on decay and despair. They were anathema to everything she was. "The heart tree," she whispered, the image from the vision burning behind her eyelids. "It was the source of our power, the physical anchor of our soul pact. When they killed me, when they burned the forest, They wounded the land itself, Darren finished, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. The blight from the Shadowlands, it's not just a curse. It's a poison spreading from that wound. Malachor is using the sight of our greatest failure to unmake my entire kingdom. He stepped back, his entire demeanor shifting. The grief was still there, a raw undercurrent, but it was now honed into the sharp, lethal edge of a king at war. The blood moon is in 6 days. Malachor will be at his most powerful. He will use the anniversary of your death to complete the ritual and sever my pack from the land forever, turning them into the mindless, blighted beasts he sends against us. He turned to the maps on the table, his movement swift and decisive. The Silverwood is a 3-day ride from here. If we leave at dawn, we can be there with time to prepare. We? Marin asked, her voice small. He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical force. The pact was made with 2 souls, Marin. It can only be mended by 2. You are my anchor. Without you, I am just a man fighting a shadow. With you, we are the weapon that was forged to end them. The fear was a cold serpent coiling in her own gut. She was not the powerful weaver from the vision, not yet. She was a girl who had spent her life hiding a secret she didn't understand. But looking at Darren, at the unshakable conviction in his face, she found a flicker of that ancient strength. The girl who had promised to find him across time would not cower now that she had. "What must we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Ronan entered without being summoned, his face a grim mask. He had clearly been listening. His eyes went from Darren to Marin and back again. The open hostility he'd shown her now replaced with a grudging, bewildered respect. He had felt the shift in his alpha, the settling of a soul that had been restless for a decade. Whatever this girl was, she was the key. "You cannot go alone, my king," Ronan said. "The Silverwood is deep within blighted territory. It is a suicide mission." "I am not going alone," Darren stated, his gaze fixed on Marin. "And I am not asking the pack to follow me. This is not a battle of swords and shields. It is a battle of souls. Marin and I will ride. You will remain here, Ronan. You will hold this camp. You will protect my people. That is my command." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Ronan bowed his head, a gesture of submission that was also a prayer. The next 2 days were a blur of tense preparation. Darren moved with a singular, ferocious purpose, assembling a pack of supplies, weapons, and ancient texts he'd had brought from the royal vaults. He treated Marin not as a fragile prisoner, but as a partner. He would point to passages in the crumbling books, his finger tracing faded symbols. "The ritual requires a catalyst of pure life," he'd murmur, more to himself than to her. "A conduit for your light." He spoke of her power with a certainty that she did not yet feel herself. Her healing of Jovan had been instinct, a desperate act of preservation. The thought of wielding that same energy as a weapon, of facing the sorcerer who had murdered her in another life, was terrifying. On the eve of their departure, he found her sitting on the cot, her hands trembling in her lap. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "You are afraid," he said. It was not an accusation. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "In the vision, I was strong. I held back 3 of his knights. I don't know how to be that person." "You are already that person," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that calmed the frantic beating of her heart. "You healed my soldier when all my best magic workers failed. You withstood a memory that nearly broke me. You crossed time itself to keep a promise. Your strength is not in your hands, Marin. It is in your soul. It is quiet and gentle, but it is more relentless than the turning of the seasons. It is the strength of life itself. That is why they fear you. That is why they could not truly destroy you." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I spent a decade as half a man, half a king, haunted by a sorrow I could not name. You have given me back my past. Do not fear the future. We will face it together." They rode out at dawn, just the 2 of them, on Darren's massive black warhorse. The camp watched them go in silence, a sea of haunted faces praying to a god they weren't sure they believed in anymore. Marin sat in front of Darren, her back pressed against his chest, his arms a protective cage around her. As they left the relative safety of the camp, the land began to change. The healthy green of the forest slowly gave way to a sick, gray pallor. The trees grew twisted and barren, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at a perpetually overcast sky. The air grew cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. This was the blight. They rode hard, stopping only for brief rests. During the day, Darren was all focus and vigilance, his silver eyes scanning the dead landscape for any sign of movement. But at night, a different man emerged. They would make a small, smokeless fire, and he would share his rations with her, ensuring she ate first. He would sit close, his presence a warm, solid shield against the oppressive silence of the blighted woods. He told her stories of his pack, of Ronan's unwavering loyalty, of the young Jovan's bravery. He was rebuilding the bridge between their two lives, piece by piece. On the third day they found it, the Silverwood, or what was left of it. It was a graveyard of ancient trees, their once shimmering silver bark now blackened and charred. The air was thick with the residue of old dark magic, a palpable miasma of grief and violence. At the center of the clearing stood the heart tree. It was a colossal skeletal ruin, its great branches stark against the gray sky. At its base, the earth was a blackened, barren scar, and it was not undefended. As they approached, dark shapes detached themselves from the shadows of the dead trees, blighted wolves. Their fur was matted and patchy. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and dark, pulsing veins, like the ones that had marked Jovan, covered their emaciated bodies. They were a perversion of Darren's own kind, a mockery of the pack bond. Darren dismounted smoothly, drawing his massive broadsword. The blade hummed with a faint silver light. "Stay on the horse, Marin," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Do not get down for any reason." He moved to meet them, and Marin witnessed for the first time why he was called the Alpha King. He became a whirlwind of black leather and shining steel, a force of nature unleashed. He did not fight like a man, but like a storm. His movements were a blur of savage grace, his blade a silver arc of death. The blighted wolves threw themselves at him, but they were no match for his focused, righteous fury. He was not just killing them. He was delivering a mercy, ending the torment of creatures that had once been noble. But more came, pouring from the woods, their numbers seeming endless. Marin's heart pounded in her chest. He was magnificent, but he was one man against a tide of darkness. She felt a desperate, clawing helplessness. She was supposed to be his anchor, his partner, and all she could do was watch. Then she saw him, standing on a ridge at the edge of the clearing, watching the battle with cold, detached amusement. Malachor. He was tall and gaunt, wrapped in robes the color of dried blood. His face was the same cruel, scarred face from her vision, unchanged by the passage of 1,000 years. His eyes glowed with the same cold, malevolent fire. He lifted a hand, and a wave of dark energy washed over the clearing. The blighted wolves renewed their attack with a mindless, desperate frenzy. One of the creatures, larger than the rest, broke through Darren's guard, its claws raking across his arm. Darren roared, more in anger than in pain, and cut the beast down, but he was bleeding, and Malachor smiled. Something inside Marin snapped. The fear, the helplessness, it all burned away, cauterized by a white-hot surge of protective rage. He would not hurt him, not again. She would not watch him die, not this time. She slipped from the horse, ignoring Darren's furious, distracted shout. She did not have a weapon. She did not have a plan. All she had was the memory of the Sunweaver from the vision, standing before the heart tree, a shield of golden light her only defense. She ran toward the skeletal remains of the great tree, her feet sinking into the ashen soil. She placed her hands on its charred, dead bark. It was cold, lifeless, but deep within, beneath the centuries of death and decay, she felt it, a tiny, faint spark, the echo of the life she had given it so long ago, the memory of the soul pact. She closed her eyes and called to it. She didn't use words or incantations. She used her will, her soul. She poured all her love for Darren, all her grief for their lost past, all her burning rage at the man who had torn them apart, into that single point of contact. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her skin, the sound of his laughter, the unbreakable promise they had made. "I am here," she whispered into the heart of the dead wood. "Anchor to Alpha, I have come back." The spark answered. A soft golden light pulsed from her hands, spreading across the bark of the tree. It was faint at first, a hesitant flicker, but it grew. The light flowed from her, down through the charred trunk, into the poisoned roots. The blackened, barren earth at the base of the tree began to glow. And from that glowing soil, a single perfect silver leaf sprouted. Unfurling in the gloom, Malakor's smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and fury. The blighted wolves faltered, whining and turning their heads, confused by the sudden surge of pure life in a land of death. The lull was all Darren needed. He charged through the remaining beasts, his eyes fixed on Malakor, but the sorcerer was no longer looking at him. His malevolent gaze was locked on Marin. "The anchor," Malakor hissed, his voice like the slithering of snakes. "Impossible! I destroyed you." "You failed," Marin said, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. The golden light was flowing from her now, a radiant aura that pushed back the oppressive gloom. Malakor lifted his obsidian dagger, the same cursed blade from the vision. "A soul can be severed more than once, girl." He lunged, not at Darren, but at her. He was unnaturally fast, a blur of red and black. Darren roared her name, trying to intercept him, but he was too far away. The memory was playing out again. The blade was coming for her heart. But this time, she was ready. She did not cower. She did not try to shield herself. She stood her ground, her hand still pressed to the glowing heart tree, and met his eyes. The golden light around her solidified, coalescing not into a shield, but into a spear of pure, blinding sunlight. Time seemed to slow. The obsidian dagger, an instrument of pure darkness, flew toward her chest, and her spear of light, an incarnation of life itself, shot from her hand to meet it. Night and day collided with a sound that was not a sound, a silent explosion of power that tore the world apart. The dream began with the warmth, not the suffocating heat of a fever, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that felt like the first sun of spring on winter-chilled skin. There was no crimson moon, no starless sky, only a soft, pearlescent light that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. He was there, not kneeling in mud and ruin, but standing whole and hale in a field of moon petals, their pale blossoms glowing around him. He turned to her, and his silver eyes held no sorrow, no fury, only a peace so profound it was breathtaking. He smiled, a true, easy smile she had only ever seen in her visions of the past. He lifted a hand, not in a desperate plea, but in a simple, welcoming gesture. His lips parted, and he spoke her name, not as a dying whisper, but as a quiet prayer of thanks. "Marin." She woke with a soft sigh, the phantom scent of moon petals clinging to her senses. The rough wool of a traveling cloak was tucked around her, and the gentle, rhythmic motion of a walking horse was a soothing cradle. She was leaning back against a solid wall of warmth, a familiar arm wrapped securely around her waist. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing, and looked up. Darren's face was above hers, etched with exhaustion, but clear of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He was watching the path ahead, his profile stark against the rising sun. A real sun, not the pale, watery disk that had hung in the sky over the blighted lands, but a glorious golden orb that painted the clouds in hues of rose and lavender. He felt her stir and looked down, and the silver eyes that met hers were filled with a quiet, overwhelming love. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The dream," she whispered, her own voice still thick with sleep. "It changed." "Everything has changed," he said, and it was the simplest, most profound truth in the world. The memory of the battle was a chaotic, brilliant blur. The collision of her light and Malakor's darkness had thrown them all back. She remembered the shriek of the sorcerer as the obsidian dagger, the vessel of his power, had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She remembered the wave of golden light that had pulsed from the heart tree, washing over the silverwood. It had not burned the blighted wolves, but cleansed them. The sickly green glow had faded from their eyes, the dark veins had vanished from their skin, and with a final, mournful howl, their spirits had been released, their bodies crumbling to clean, white ash. She remembered Darren reaching Malakor's stunned form, his silver blade a final, swift judgment. And then she remembered nothing but darkness, as the last of her strength had given out. She had woken hours later in his arms, curled by the base of the heart tree. It was no longer a charred skeleton. The golden light had faded, but life had returned. 100 new silver leaves adorned its branches, shimmering in the moonlight. and the earth around its base was covered in a soft carpet of new moss. The air smelled of rain and new life. The wound on the land had not been erased, but it had begun to heal. Ronan met us at the edge of the territories, Darren told her now, his voice a quiet narrative as they rode through the healthy green forest. The blight is receding, like a tide pulling away from the shore. The men are weak, but the curse is broken. The healers say the wounds have begun to close. Marin leaned her head back against his shoulder, a bone-deep weariness still clinging to her, but it was a clean exhaustion, the satisfying ache after a long and worthy labor. The pack? They are restless, eager for their alpha's return. He paused, his arm tightening around her. They are eager for their anchor's return. Oakfall came into view as the sun crested the hills. It looked the same, the neat little houses, the smoke curling from the chimneys, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, but she was not the same girl who had fled from it in terror. They did not ride into the square. Darren guided the horse to the quiet lane behind the apothecary, stopping beside her small herb garden. He dismounted first, then reached up for her. His hands were gentle on her waist as he lifted her down, holding her for a moment longer than necessary. When her feet touched the ground, they stood there in the quiet morning light, surrounded by the familiar scents of lavender and chamomile. It felt like a lifetime ago. Alara came out of the back door, a basket of herbs in her hand. She stopped dead, her eyes widening as she saw them. She looked at Marin, truly looked at her, and the old healer's gaze was sharp and knowing. She saw the change, the quiet strength that now resided where fear had once lived. Her gaze shifted to the king, who stood beside Marin not as a captor, but as a guardian. His hand had found Marin's, their fingers lacing together in a way that was both natural and unbreakable. Alara's stern face softened, a rare, small smile touching her lips. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a blessing, an acceptance, a farewell. Marin knew she could not stay. Her life was no longer here, among the poultices and feverfew. Her life was with the man beside her, with the pack that was her sacred duty to anchor. But there was one last thing she needed. "I will be a moment," she said softly to Darren. He nodded, his silver eyes never leaving her, as she walked into the apothecary. The bell above the door chimed, the same sound that had once marked Alara's departure and the beginning of her terror. Now it sounded like a gentle goodbye. She walked through the familiar, comforting space, her fingers trailing over the dried herbs, the clay pots, the worn wooden counter. She went to the small room upstairs, her room, where she had woken screaming from the same nightmare for 20 years. It was just a room now. The ghosts were gone. She gathered nothing. The simple linen tunics, the soft-soled shoes, they belonged to a girl who no longer existed. She was Marin of the Sunweavers, anchor of the North Pack. She was the mate of the Alpha King, and she was going home. When she came back outside, Darren was waiting. He had not moved, his presence a solid, reassuring certainty in the shifting world. He held out his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at the small, safe village behind her, and then at the vast, unknown world that waited with him. The future was not a gentle path. Malachor was gone, but the Serpent clan remained. The pack was healing, but the scars of the curse ran deep. Their own past was a beautiful, tragic story. They were only just beginning to reread. It would not be easy. But for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. The dream that had been her curse was now her strength. She had faced his death 1,000 times in her sleep. She would spend her life ensuring it never came to pass in the light of day. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am ready." He lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her, settling her back against his chest. They were a single entity, two halves of a soul finally made whole. He urged the horse forward, away from the village, toward the north, toward their future. As they crested the hill overlooking Oakfall, Marin looked back one last time. It was a memory, a part of her story, but it was not the end. It was the shore she had left, to finally join her love in the river of time, wherever it might lead them.